This is Nathan Holstead. He is doing a presentation on Turn Your Head and Cough, why architecture risk assessments are like being a general surgeon. And we've got a couple of just general announcements. One of them is there is a raffle in Grand 4. I heard one of the things that they're raffling off are tickets to DerbyCon. And we also, if you brought your little hackers with you, the Hack for Kids Web Hacking Exposed has been changed. It's now running from 3 to 5 p.m. Thank you very much. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. So yeah, we're going to talk about security risk assessments and how to improve our quality of service offering with them. So to start out, we're going to give you a little bit of introduction about who I am beyond the one that we already did. So I am Dr. Hume. As some may know me, I do a lot of the CFP running here. So I usually get to stare at spreadsheets all the time and see who's talking, who isn't talking, and if we should let them talk. Thankfully, the people who make these decisions let me talk at my own conference, so that was very nice of them. But I also, in my professional life, I am a security consultant currently at Cigital Incorporated. We are a private company that does a lot of security consulting services in a number of different areas. So I've dabbled in architecture reviews and vulnerability assessments, as well as doing some metrics and software security initiative intelligence platform stuff. There's some other work too that I'll be doing. We can, if you're curious about that, some of my other projects, talk to me offline at the end of the talk. So let's get into the meat of the matter, the introduction. So as I mentioned earlier, here's at a high level what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about security architecture reviews. I'm going to go over an introduction. For those who aren't aware of the detailed process, I will go over what the steps are in a security architecture review, what we're looking at accomplishing with one of these security architecture reviews, so we get a handle of how they work. At that point, there's enough foundational knowledge on these things that we're going to go into talking about the doctor's side of things and the analogy, and talking about how doctors and security architects are a lot alike in a number of ways, and how we can actually learn from each other in terms of process, with the end goal of this analogy being looking at how we can start scaling up and scaling out security architecture practices in a larger enterprise. So, what is a security architecture review? We're basically looking at the blueprints of a piece of software. Hopefully this is being done towards the beginning of the software's creation, and we're trying to pick out flaws. Of course, I was looking for a blueprint of the Death Star because, of course, that would have been one great large project that could have really used the security architecture review because we would have known about that exhaust port. But, I think the Enterprise is certainly a good example because for the most part, minus, everybody seemed to have a warp core breach every week, it was relatively well designed. But these also have a number of different names to them. And the processes are slightly different, but the end results tend to be the same goal. So I'm going to argue here, and some people might disagree with me, threat modeling, risk assessments, architectural risk assessments, and security architectural reviews. Roughly the same thing. But most will have maybe a slightly different method, maybe slightly different verbiage. But in the end, what you're really looking at doing is enumerating what risky elements there exist in a system, what level of risk they have, and then how can I control for that risk. So basically tell me what's wrong with my system so I can fix it. And usually sometimes it can go as complicated as NIST risk ratings, and you're going into very detailed levels of what the risks are for each of these what the threat actors are, the trust boundaries, etc. Or it may be as simple as here is an issue and the business risk. Here is a control for that. And here is maybe where it relates into our enterprise's paradigm for classifying these things. And no matter what of these models you use, and again, this is a little bit of a generalization, you're going to find that the review process is roughly the same in each of these. So you can go out and read Gary McGraw's excellent book on software security and looking at his discussions of risk assessments. You could grab Shostak's book on threat modeling. And things, the process is roughly the same. And potentially you're going to go into some various enterprises and see they may have a custom process. It's going to start with gathering information. You're going to go out, you're going to talk to the engineers. You're going to try and grab as much of the architectural documentation there is. Again, I'm making the assumption at this point that this documentation exists. That is a very important element. And then you're also going to go out and potentially interview the developers. So I don't know, for those who sat in on Ken White's talk, when you were listening to the auditing of the OpenSSL project, you heard Ken mention that a lot of what they were able to do when they were auditing this was go talk to the OpenSSL development teams and get information on some of the various interesting sort of side issues with that system. If this looks really weird in the code, why are you all doing this? And you can get some of the backstory on that. And that backstory helps inform you on a number of the security decisions that are part of this architecture. And the other very interesting thing you can do is you can get two engineers talking about the same element of the system, see where they differ in what the heck they're talking about. And you know that there's probably a flaw in the system right there if two engineers are describing the same little system differently. And from that point, as you've gathered all this information, you've jotted down the weaknesses as you go, you start marking them out and getting a list of them with all these weaknesses, and then you can go through them and figure out what the mitigations are going to be. So depending upon policy, these may be technical mitigations. These may be social mitigations in terms of internal company policy. But you go through each of these weaknesses and you need a specific mitigation. And you might tie these to a threat. You might not. Again, that depends on the details of which of these systems you might be using for a review. And then the fun part that everybody loves to do is writing the report. You get to write all these up in a nice, well-defined document. And you might find that you've documented the system by this point far better than any of the actual engineering teams did. And then you follow up. You can hand them the report, and you might want to check back in, see if they have any questions, see if something needs to be explained. You might have a report out call. You might be sitting with the team going through page by page so they actually understand what they're doing. And there's some potential other follow-ups we can do, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. It fits in a little bit more with what we can learn from analogies, the analogy of the doctor situation, because it's something that I don't think we actually do in practice right now. So again, gathering information. We're talking about gaining records. We can sit in interviews, just like doctors do. Finding the weak components. We determine the mitigations, we write our report, and then we follow up. So, wrong type of doctor. There we go. What does this actually have to do with doctors? And, well, I want to preface this a little side effect. This analogy isn't perfect. Like all analogies, you can't argue with them perfectly. So what we will do is I'm going to first discuss where this analogy fits, and then I will go through and discuss where it doesn't fit, and then also where we can still learn from these. So let's go into a few general assumptions. First off, I'm assuming that as audience here, you're interested in this talk, you believe security architecture reviews are useful. Second, I am assuming that you're interested in understanding how to scale up this review process. Perhaps that means handling more of your software portfolio, or going from just maybe 1 or 2 a year to 10 a year. But the point being, there's some interest in taking this from maybe these small, very targeted solutions to trying to encompass more of the software portfolio closer to design time, to start stamping out a number of these flaws before you get to the penetration test. And at that point you realize, oh man, it's too late. We can't fix anything because it's already implemented. And finally, I want to talk about how to increase the consistency and the quality of these. So I'm going to talk about this in a bit. There's a lot of an art and a lot of a science to this. And whenever you have that weird combination, you might have potential consistency and quality issues. You want to make sure each review is consistently the same level of quality, and you don't have sort of curveballs that come out if a second person were to come in, study the same system, and generate the report from that. So let's go into the analogy. At a high level, what makes a reviewer like a doctor? Well, they both have patients, right? Patients require a diagnosis. And you have a large number of patients that must be seen regularly, right? So let's go into that a little bit. So when I say security architecture has patients, well, unlike a doctor, we're not seeing someone come into the office and talk to, oh, my back's hurting, my knee's hurting, I've got arthritis, my gallbladder's acting up, oh my gosh, I've got a knife in my chest and I need sutures. It's more like these people right here, it's a bunch of engineers who are working on a system. In this case, I am totally calling out game developers. But in general, it's a bunch of sort of a diverse group of software engineers. We're not targeting one person, right? We're targeting an engineering team. And their ailment isn't necessarily a physical ailment, but this is my software. It's sick. Could you please make it better with your security architecture review? And diagnoses aren't the same, right? You're not looking for heart attacks. You're looking for heart bleeds. You're looking for these major flaws in the application instead of maybe specific ailments or diagnoses. Blood sugar's too low, take a sugar pill. In this case, it's, well, your spleen was designed a little wrong. We should probably go in and fix that. And by large patient flows, what I'm talking about here in terms of our analogy is if we've looked at a modern primary care physician's office, right? They're seeing who knows how many numbers of people every day. Who here has ever had a PCP visit go exactly on schedule according to plan, right? Where you're in and out when you were supposed to be. It's usually, 15 minutes, 20 minutes along. Okay, now the doctor showed up. And they're seeing just a ton of patients every day. When you look at it and you're trying to scale up architecture reviews, it's very much the same way. I can speak from personal experience. Once you start getting into these very large application portfolios and you want to scale out to cover these large application portfolios, you're going to need either a huge amount of labor or a very clean and crisp process because things are going to start getting backed up. You're going to be waiting for information back from a few teams, and you're going to try and work on something else, but maybe that gets paused. And then eventually, just like going into a PCP's office, your queue is going to start getting backed up over time. So we're both dealing with these large patient flows. Of course, in their case, it's human beings talking about whatever ailments they might have. In the security architecture's case, it's going to be a bunch of internal engineering teams giving you their internal applications, hoping you can tell them what's wrong with it. So I would hope at this point that I have gone into at least enough of an argument about why this analogy makes sense, such that now we can start thinking about various aspects of where doctors operate and try and perform these functions in terms of patient care, in terms of dealing with high patient flow, and then how we can adapt that information into a security architecture process in order to make it more robust and more useful overall. And in fact, I think a lot of these lessons can tie into, in many ways, what was talked about yesterday, both in Ian Amit's and Wolf's talk, right? So Ian was talking about threat modeling for the foundations for actionable threat intelligence, right? If you're an organization looking into threat intelligence, you're going to have to be doing threat modeling. And if you have a number of diverse areas, in which case these need threat modeling, you're going to have to learn how to scale those up. And as Wolfgang was talking about with security development culture, so there was a lot of focus on what we're going to do during the development process to keep quality software through this process, to keep it going through this process in a relatively routine manner. But he also mentioned at the beginning of any of your software development processes, before you get into the static analysis tools, before you get into the dynamic analysis tools, you need to have an architecture review. So let's see then, what we can learn from a doctor's office, from this doctor analogy, to try and meet a lot of these requirements we can have that end up benefiting us outside of just the reviews, benefiting us by being able to put in useful threat intelligence. So I want to focus on 3 areas of this analogy where we can learn from. The first, I want to focus on interviewing the patient. Of course, that is a huge part of being a doctor, as specifically a primary care physician. Getting there, the doctor comes in, he starts talking to you, or she starts talking to you about what's wrong. And hopefully from that information, they're able to give you a diagnosis. Second, I'd like to cover how the art and science areas of both of them, and how the medical field has dealt with this notion of diagnosis being both an artistic element in terms of the doctor's ability to take the free-form information that you provide them, process that through the knowledge that they learned during medical school, and try and give you an accurate, specific problem. And finally, the wonderful bit about patients not listening. And I can certainly say I have never 100% listened necessarily to what my doctor has told me to do all the time. And of course, in that case, that harms me personally if I get sicker or, re-injure myself. Of course, in the security context, that means, well, they didn't listen to me when I told them to secure this server, and we just got breached again, and there goes everybody's health insurance information. Or I guess I could also pick on Sony, right? Where we've seen Sony, different ailments, and it's possible that security person there might have informed them. Right? So let's go into the patient interview side of things, and let's start with one of our favorite television quotes from our favorite fake television doctor. Everybody lies. Right? And security architecture reviews are no different. If you're going to be interviewing a person, they're going to lie. And I've broken this down into 2 types of lies. So we can start with the notion of the malicious lie. Right? So this is where you're going to go and do your interview for an architecture team. And they're basically going to tell you what you, for a software team, and they're going to tell you what you want to hear. Because they figure that your outcome of this is based on them giving you the exact right answer. They're not going to be able to go forward unless you give them an A check plus whatever the heck great grade. And so you ask them, oh, so do you guys salt and hash passwords? Yeah, we salt and hash passwords. So you're using SHA-2? Yeah, we're using SHA-2. So you have ACLs on all the configuration files, your logs with conflict. Yeah, we've got ACLs. It's great. But then, of course, the benefit of dealing with that then is, of course, if you can go in and look at the code, you can get the configuration files, get a process set up so that you can have some background, a little bit of checks on the background of this information that they're telling you. You go over there and you suddenly find out, oh, they're using MD5. They're not using salts. They're just sort of putting it there. There are no ACLs on the log files, and we're logging when a user changes their password, and we're keeping the passwords in plain text in the logs because you never know. We might have to debug the password changing process, so we might as well just dump everything in there. And suddenly you find out, when you have some of this background information, by looking at the code, or sometimes in being able to interview multiple persons who work on that project, you find out that the team that you'd originally dealt with had just told you a bunch of bogus information. And of course, with doctors, there's some ways they deal with that in terms of being able to check some of their comprehensive records, right? They'll either have seen a patient over time, or if it's a hospital, there might be extra records, or if someone's coming in complaining about pain, you can always check with one of their previous doctors to see if this is a person who does have serious consistent pain issues, or if this is a person who is just attempting to get opiates. And so from there, one of the lessons we learn is that we need to be able to have secondary sources of information. Maybe another architecture review, security architecture review person in the organization that you can check back with, who might have reviewed the application previously, a previous iteration of it. It might also be being able to go in and check many of the sort of nitty-gritty details of the application. Actually look at the configuration files. Maybe look at some of the source code. Seeing if you can get the solid design documents for background information, instead of just blindly relying on what an engineering team says. But we also have accidental lies. And these might not be, one might not consider these lies as such. One might consider them incorrect information. But when you think about it, the notion of these engineering teams, right, they're not necessarily security professionals. They don't necessarily have the vocabulary of a security professional. So they might not tell you things necessarily in the manner that you would expect them to if you were talking to another security professional. This comes up a lot when you talk about hashing, right? You can talk to an engineer. They're like, no, we encrypt the passwords. Wait, what? Yeah, we use SHA-2. We encrypt the passwords. No. You're hashing the passwords. Your SHA-2 is a hash. And so there's sometimes where they're not lying per se, but it's just a misunderstanding necessarily of the vocabulary. And of course, when it comes to security, the devil is always in the details. And so one way to do it there is, again, checking for secondary sources of information, but it's also potentially asking questions in a slightly different way, or potentially asking questions in sort of rephrasing them a little bit, or asking them multiple times. So again, instead of just saying, well, do you hash, or how do you store passwords? When you leave it open like that, that leaves them a means of saying, well, we encrypt them, when they really meant hashing. So you can start asking, again, you can get a little bit more detailed. So do you hash and salt passwords? Yes. Do you use SHA-2? Yes. I'm like, okay, great, we're good. Of course, if we go back to the previous slide, the notion of malicious lies, you have to double check some of that to make sure that they're not leading you on. So this is also a sort of regular challenge. And this is, again, doctors are able to also, besides multiple questions, they're also able to rely on labs and some other sort of more objective sources of information that I will talk about a little bit later in some of my arguments in regards to how we can continue things. So there's also this notion of being a doctor as well as being a security architect is equal parts art and science, just sort of like bartending, right? There's a very strong level of chemistry in bartending. And there is also a great art to it. Of course, if you guys are going to go see Jack Daniel's training this afternoon, you'll find that out, right? But when we're dealing with software systems, it's really the same way. A lot of the science is the notion of the engineering and best practices in terms of if A occurs, do B. If you're storing a password, hash salt. if you are storing confidential information in crypt. If you are sending something over a trust boundary, authorize and authenticate. And the science ends up being the components we've engineered to that, at least to some extent. And in some situations, we can actually prove the correctness of these engineered components that we have. But then there's a bit of an art of it, and the sort of art of it are these sort of horribly devilish things in the details that sneak up and try and bite you. Because not every system is exactly the same, right? This is where you have to now start mapping this nebulous concept of the system you're dealing with, that maybe you've got this Amazon cloud system that's also hooked into Rackspace, and maybe you have a couple different software frameworks running on there. And then it's also sending text messages to somebody via this using a different platform. And you're combining a number of these systems together that you now have to start picking apart and figuring out where the specific trust boundaries are. And you might have a situation where you'll go to one security architect, and they'll be very thorough and demarcate any time information is transferring between two even small components of a system. Or you might go to another security architect who is really just concerned with, say, the information that's traversing over an open network between the internal system and the cloud, between maybe between the two clouds themselves, but not necessarily the systems within the cloud that you're combining together. And so there's components in both of those situations that you really have to deal with. So what you end up having to do there is having a very standard set of processes. And doctors, and many times, do this via diagnostic standards. And they have those huge volumes of various different conditions and the symptoms that those conditions show. And they can start going through those and narrowing it down. And we somewhat have that with patterns, with security architecture. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, that in terms of the standardization of these patterns. I mean, doctors have a very sort of tried and true standardized way of doing these diagnoses. And they have very core books that list the number of conditions. They don't have these sort of conflicting standards, in many ways, that the security architects do. And that's really how you have to combine the art and the science portion. You have to sit there and come up with strong standards, processes, and documentation that you can rely upon when making those decisions to keep them consistent. But we also have this situation, right, where, as I mentioned earlier, patients don't listen. And what I'm talking about here is that we can give the developing teams a set of advice on how to mitigate their issues. We can give them a list of what exactly they need to do. You need to put authentication in here. You aren't authenticating between systems, so you need to use some sort of single sign-on process. You aren't protecting against cross-site request forgery. You need to put in the token synchronizer pattern. Or you need to use macked and encrypted view states if it's ASP.NET. But you can make those recommendations. The question is, how can you get the patients to listen? How can you get the developer teams to listen? Just like doctors have a very big challenge when dealing with chronic ailments of how to get their patients to listen. And so a lot of what we deal with here is very similar situations. It's having to deal with chronic routine issues within an organization that keep popping up. Because if you have CSRF in one system, I guarantee you're going to have CSRF in multiple systems. Now we have it a little bit easier. Doctors can just continue until they're blue in the face, which tends to be the thing. You as part of your ethics as a doctor, you end up telling the patient what they need to hear. You have diabetes, you need to start controlling your blood sugar. You can't force them to control their blood sugar. But every time they come in, you remind them. Now we can do that as security architects as well. Hey, you have to use this sort of protection. The benefit is, in many organizations, process can dictate exactly what they do. So this is where, as a security architect, the group that is performing these can reach up to higher tiers of the organization and make it clear that we either A, need to have something in our standard policy guideline of, if you are writing an application that is sending things over the web, put in this token synchronizer pattern in every single form. And of course, the wonderful thing with computers is we can start engineering solutions to automate this for us. I guarantee you give a developer a library that will do this for them very easily. You'll see it in all your programs. So suddenly listening doesn't become nearly as much of an inconvenience, right? And that's usually why patients don't listen. I don't want to do that because that's a lot of work and it inconveniences me and it's not going to be any fun. Developers are the same way. I don't want to put in this protection because it's not fun. It takes away from my work. Well, we have the ability to make it easy for them. In many ways, while it's a challenge, you can give a developer an easy button, and that can solve some things about patients not listening. But this also talks about sort of the idea of improving patient outcome, right? Doctors are concerned with long-term care. We're not just in it for the current system. A doctor isn't just in it for the current system. And that's with security architecture, right? That's not security architecture review. It's the same. If we care just about the current system we're reviewing, we're just going to review the same risks in the next system that we see. So we need to start being concerned with chronic disease management. Of course, in the case of the doctors, you're constantly visiting your doctor. If you say you have diabetes, they're monitoring your blood sugar, they're helping you manage your diet. Well, when you set up a security architecture program, you need to consider the idea of having these teams coming back for reviews to understand where they're doing things right, where they're doing things wrong. Because if you don't, they're just going to keep coming back with the same CSRF issues, with the same cross-site scripting issues, with the same authentication issues, the same encryption issues, every single time. But you can get them coming back regularly, you can monitor their problems, you can help educate them. And through this feedback process, you're now also learning where to bring in library creation to aid the developers in helping making applications for your platform. And that is also, in many ways, where the healthy living comes in. You're informing the developers how to develop healthily. Right? You're letting them know we have these tools. We've created these tools for you to make your life easier. Here you go. So, to me, that was really a lot of the core areas where doctoring, medical doctoring, is a lot like software doctoring as a security architect. Very clear areas where those analogies cross over, as well as very clear areas where we can sort of look at how medical doctors are doing things in their current practice, how we can start shifting that over into the security community to improve our security architecture practices. So we can then start going into learning the differences from the differences where this analogy breaks down. Because again, not all analogies are perfect, and as much as I love using them as a scaffolding to come up with sort of interesting arguments on how we can improve software security, I always run into the problem of, well, this is nice, but at this point it doesn't quite, make sense. It sort of breaks down. So I think one of these is the notion of publishing case studies. So one of the things that doctors can do, and that they do perform, is the notion of publishing a case study, where you have this document that gives you either a hypothetical or a realistic patient. It gives you a list of their conditions, and it helps you think about what the diagnosis would be. So some of these are sort of training sites. So for example, UPIT's Department of Pathology. As I was sort of going through and researching a number of things for this talk, I found this site, which is great because it's not behind a paywall for a medical journal, which makes it very easy for people to look into. But it's this idea of, well, we have a set of doctors who provided this. We'll give you a clinical history, this sort of overarching description, and maybe actually some slides here of x-rays, right? And of course, this will give you a 30-year-old patient. He's developing these symptoms. We've done these processes so far to try and get an idea of what the ailment might be. What's the diagnosis? Then they actually have a little link on the page. They don't, if I recall, they don't actually give away the answer on the same page. You sort of have to click through. So it's this really cool little training resource, right? Well, when was, for anybody here who's might have recently done a security architecture review, when was the last time you saw a published case study of a full security architecture review? Like end-to-end, or almost end-to-end, and then they left out the threat and the risk model, right? The deliverable that we have, and just gave you the information and said, so what were the threats and mitigations for this? There really isn't one. And we don't really do this. And we don't really do this because we don't really have this comfort in letting people know the IP of our systems, which is fine. I get that, right? You're a big enterprise. You don't want to give away the secret sauce. But it creates challenges because we are not necessarily sharing this information, these case studies, which helps create consistency in diagnosis. And speaking of consistency, there's sort of the notion of standards and best practices. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, right? We have a few standards, which, you know, the great thing about standards is it gives somebody a chance to create their own. But it's not really like the medical field, where there's very clear organizations that provide standards for very clear aspects of medicine. So the CDC, we have a lot of public health aspects to the CDC, and we have, you know, standards for program evaluation, standards for this, standards for that. But you have these sort of core regulating bodies that have very clear mandates, very clear mandates for areas in which they provide information to, and you can get standards from that. And, you know, right, the American Medical Association's the other one. You have a bunch of doctors who go in and provide, thank you very much, who provide areas in which they can get standards for how they practice medicine, maybe doing clinics. I actually saw, if you look through the AMA site, I found on the front page I believe there was actually standards on how to deal with payments in the medical clinic. So as a side note, that would be a wonderful thing to look at to see how they talk about that and how it I'd like to see too how it complies with some of the best practices that we talk about in the security community. But the idea being, we have these organizations that try and help provide this information. We don't really have that, right, in security. We don't really have governing bodies that give us, for security architecture at least, I think we're getting there. You know, we have the penetration testing evaluation standard, and we're starting to get there with some of the areas. I don't really see that right yet with security architecture. I'll mention an organization later that I actually think would be a great focus for that, to provide some of that direction for us. The other thing is labs and diagnostics. And I sort of mentioned that earlier when we were talking about the case studies. You know, they have labs and diagnostics in medicine. You can go and an MRI and you get a wonderful image of your brain. I mean, heck, you can see brain activity in a dead salmon. Great paper, by the way. Look it up. You know, you get this very interesting information that potentially helps with a diagnosis. X-rays, you know, the classical one, great. X-rays, we've been using X-rays in the medical field for who knows how long, right? You know, you can see broken bones, a number of other issues. We don't really have that. in security architecture. We don't really have these tools. Another useful one that you almost see all the time at the doctor, right? You go and you get your CBC, your complete blood count. Now, a very simple thing, it can potentially tell a doctor a ton. It can tell you if you have leukemia. It can tell you if you have an infection. It can tell you if you have anemia. It can tell you if you have hemochromatosis, the opposite of anemia, practically. All these different things from a relatively objective, for the most part, and by objective I mean it is more objective than talking to somebody and asking them how they feel on a scale of 1 to 10. And that helps them come up with diagnoses. Think about what we can do in regards to that for security architecture. We don't really have anything. Static code review, well, that's not security architecture. Well, if you give them coverity, that's just a static analysis. You sort of want that later on in your software design cycle. Penetration test, well, if you're able to do a penetration test, you've probably already screwed up on the whole architecture review thing because there's actually something in place for you to penetration test. We're supposed to be doing this well to the beginning of the process. So we don't really have anything that allows us to objectively check very quickly the software and what's going on in an objective manner. We still really have to rely on those developer interviews, the engineer interviews. And the best we can do in terms of an objective check is look at the code. But manual code review, even especially if they haven't even really put any code in place yet, doesn't really help. So it would be interesting, and again, this is potentially just an issue where the analogy breaks. We might not be able to find an area that we can sort of bring in tooling this early in the architectural review process, but it's something to think about. There's also, this notion of imperfect information, right? We might not have contacts that can tell us everything. This is especially difficult, say, if we have a situation where we are dealing with a vendor who's providing us software, and we have to deal with a sales contact of the vendor. In terms of medicine, they tend to have a bit more perfect information in the sense that they can rely on labs. They do have the first-person account of the situation, right? They have the patient that can at least tell you all the information they know. But sometimes we have to rely on maybe not dealing with the engineers, because again, as I said, you're dealing with a salesperson at the client or the vendor who has given you this product, and you have to rapidly figure out, well, okay, how can I sort of ask my questions so that this client sales manager person can answer them accurately, because this has to be done in a few weeks, and there's no way they're going to put me through to an engineer at the vendor to try and get me this information. Or sometimes the vendor just doesn't want to give it to you. They will wrap it around this notion of, well, we don't really want to tell you what security we have in place because it's internal proprietary information and we have a number of other people using this product, so we don't want to tell you because that might jeopardize them. And you have to start making a judgment then on this imperfect information. You don't necessarily have the same problem in most cases in medicine. I think a certain argument can be made if you have an ER patient who is now comatose or unconscious, you obviously can't talk to them about what happened. But there's also this notion of institutionalization that doctors have. If you come into a hospital or a doctor's office, if you come to the ER, they can hospitalize you for an overnight stay, and you, depending on the situation, you are then sort of legally required to stay there. The same requires to force institutionalization in certain severe cases of mental health, right? You can't necessarily do that in a security architecture review in an organization, especially because even if you put in place, right, there's a policy that says, well, if you're not giving me this information, or if your system is just this badly designed, we've got to put you in timeout and you have to go back and redesign everything. Well, eventually you're going to have a situation where somebody from the executive level comes down and says, well, this is a core business application. We need to keep going with it. But you're dumping client data in the shared directory in the center of our organization. We can't have that. Well, it's too bad. This is mission critical. We have to go through this. Well, you're not encrypting client information going to this remote server over the internet. It's going in the clear. Can we at least encrypt it with SSL, TLS? No, we have to go through. And so eventually, in the business context, you're going to get overridden. And even if you have that policy, you're not going to be able to put it in place for the most serious situations that you want, because mission critical situations tend to always have a golden parachute. But not all is lost. We've gotten some good lessons out of this so far in terms of how we can sort of expand things from our analogy. But we also learned that there's a number of things doctors are able to do that just don't seem to have clear guidance for us. Or at least maybe, I should say, they don't seem to have clear guidance. As I look at them, there's probably somebody out there smarter than I am that might be able to put two and two together. So let's start closing up this talk with the idea of, so what is the future then of our doctor security architect? And that's where I want to see, well, how can we be more like doctors in certain ways? Let's expand this, what can we learn from the medical field, again, to help improve our processes? As I mentioned earlier, we want to worry about scaling up. We want to deal with that flow. And we need to make sure that our consistency and quality are as high as they possibly can. So there's I think 4 areas, sort of off the top of my head, that I've been able to think of. I'm sure there are many more, but we have a very limited time for this talk. So first off, residencies, right? Doctors have residencies where they are kind of doctors, they're kind of graduated, but they're still learning. We also have the ability to share findings and case studies. We talked about that a little bit earlier. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail there. As well as sharing medications, quality treatments. And this is something that they do in the medical field in a number of hospital groups. But also standardizing the diagnostics. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where we have a number of different ways of doing things. So, as I mentioned, we're doctors now. There we go. The white lab coat ones, not the ones with time machines. And it'd be nice to have residencies. The question is then, what does a security architecture residency look like? It'd be nice to have somebody give them an internship and put them into the environment before they graduate with their security degree. But of course, unlike somebody who's going to medical school, right? Well, medical school, we know you're going to be a doctor. Well, I guess you can't say, well, we're going to send you to security school. It would be nice if we had such a thing, right? But the best we're able to do right now is maybe have a subsection of our computer science program that sort of talks about security when they can, and it isn't always the huge portion of your credits per se. So it would be interesting to find a way, and this might be a way of setting this up internal to an organization, of setting up residencies for training. Maybe you send somebody from your SOC wants to go to do bigger and better things. Take them along with the security architects for a bit to train them up before putting them in a full-time position, giving them a ton of responsibility. Sharing findings, right? Sharing our case studies, our results. I would argue, IEEE Center for Secure Design, they're a really cool group. The Center for Secure Design sort of does this. They kind of have an OWASP equivalent, but for flaws. But it would be nice to see if there was a way that we could talk about publishing case studies. What is wrong with systems and enough detail of these systems to make these case studies useful. This is going to be more of an interesting social challenge for the field, because we're dealing with many times intellectual property of the organizations providing these reviews. But I think it's doable. I think it's potentially we can find very creative ways of doing this. I honestly, outside the Center for Secure Design, I see a problem of being I haven't seen anybody else do this, because there's this problem of sharing their IP. sharing treatments. How do we stop these flaws that we commonly see? What are our standards and practices? Again, I think the Center for Secure Design does a number of this, and you can look at their white papers, and they really talk about this. But there are others. I mean, you look at OWASP, right? They kind of have in their top 10. There's sort of flaws in some ways. You can sort of generalize a lot of the top 10 into talking about input validation, things like that. There's also open security architecture in the open group that kind of have patterns for how to deal with some of these flaws. But many times these architecture patterns tend to be very general. And they're like, oh, here's what you do with the cloud. But you have problems then of dealing with specifics, right? So think about, I'll give a great analogy again as an example from doctors. It's like saying, well, if you have cancer, do this. Well, we've quickly found that for the various different types of cancer, various different treatments are far more effective. And that is very similar to saying, well, if you're using the cloud, do this. Well, I'm pretty sure my treatment for Amazon is going to be different from Rackspace, is going to be different from SoftLayer, is going to be different from the numerous other cloud services that have existed, will exist, and are currently existing. And so we have to deal with this problem of being openly general in our mitigations. So I could almost see, and of course the interesting way is constructing this to be useful, the giant book of security mitigations for specific situations. And finally, standardizing the diagnostic process. We have threat modeling. Shostak's book is great. We have application security. I couldn't find a Creative Commons picture of Gary's application security book. So picture Gary's book there. He's got a method, right? So we've got two great methods. We now have enterprise secret sauce. I guarantee you go to a large financial institution. You go to a large automotive institution. You go to any, Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company that has a huge software portfolio. I bet each one of them has their own method internally. Except for, Microsoft obviously has theirs. And you'll go to these different groups. And they'll each have their slightly own different one. It would be nice to have a single standard that we knew everybody kind of followed as much as anybody follows a standard, instead of having a bunch of standards that aren't really exactly the same, that are all slightly different, and that really makes it very difficult to write up common treatments and common diagnostics. Because if everybody's using a different system, we basically have like 5 different versions of the treatment book, because it'd have to be written in a slightly different way to make sense for that specific methodology. So I think eventually we might be able to agree in the future. Eventually, I think as we start having to do more and more security architecture reviews, as this becomes a bigger and bigger thing, right? We're finally getting the whole pen testing thing down. We're finally doing a pretty good job on static code review, though that's sort of the middle ground we're finally improving. So I think eventually we're going to start really building up the security architecture side of things. So it's going to happen. But we have to take baby steps every day at a time. So a few minutes before the next speaker comes in, if anybody has questions, comments, consultations, thank you very much for lending me your ears for the past 50 minutes. And if anybody would like to tell me how horribly wrong I have been for the last 50 minutes, that works too. Okay, so this is an interesting question. So a lot of it is being able to then ask for useful information on the mitigations. Now, any good security architect should point you in the right direction, or should at least be familiar with your institution's resources, assuming they are an integral part of your institution. But then it's just a matter of following through with those recommendations. Or if they haven't given you valuable ones, follow up and say, excellent, I don't quite understand what you're telling me to do here for the mitigation. Can we sit and talk for 15, 20 minutes, or maybe it doesn't even have to take that long, of how can I fix this? And again, part of that may be figuring out how to better integrate that fix into the process in the firm. Because this is also an opportunity for a developer on the wrong side who potentially has the trenches view of how the development process works. Might find, oh, we have an issue with our process that's causing that vulnerability to come up a lot. This needs to be brought up and potentially fixed. And so that allows you a way to sort of escalate these chronic internal problems and solve them in a manner which wouldn't have happened otherwise without that conversation. Okay. Well, thank you. We will let the other speaker set up. Oh, it's lunch. Yes, that's right. Unless they really want to go early.